We are going to continue now with Ellery Foutch, a brand new Vermonter. Welcome. A new faculty member at Middlebury College. Ellery is an assistant professor of American Studies at Middlebury College. Before joining the faculty at Middlebury, she also taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. She received her PhD in the history of art from the University of Pennsylvania with a dissertation entitled Arresting Beauty, the Perfectionist Impulse of Peale's Butterflies. Heade's Hummingbirds, I've got to get my glasses on now, Blaschka's Flowers, and Sandow's Body. Her research has been supported by grants and fellowships from the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Wyeth Foundation, Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Philadelphia Art Center for the History of Science, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Foutch earned her MA from the Williams College Graduate Program in the History of Art, where I believe she knew Mark Simpson, and her BA in Art History from Wellesley College. She's currently working on a book manuscript focused on 19th century ideas about perfection and its preservation in art, natural history, and mass culture. Join me in welcoming Ellery Foutch.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I wanted to thank everyone for making this possible today, especially Karen Peterson, Narda Carlson, Rebecca Hartje, Barbara Rathburn, and Lauren Moschner, and of course Tom Denenberg. So, and thanks to all of you for being here and for making the symposium possible also. As with almost all scholarship, I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants today, and a lot of my work has really benefited from the vast body of work about Martin Johnson Heade, amassed by scholars such as Sarah Cash, Catherine Manthorn, Franklin Kelly, more recent work by Maggie Chow, and of course the many books and wonderful scholarly contributions of Ted Stebbins, who I think is listed on your bibliography, and who really remains the expert on Heade. But let's see. I'll get my slides going for you. So today I'll be primarily focusing on Martin Johnson Heade's obsessive reworking of canvases and compositions of hummingbirds, and the ways in which his Gems of Brazil project suggestively transformed hummingbirds from organic, potentially decaying, feathered bodies into hard, glittering gemstones, focusing on this 1866 work in the Shelburne's own collection, seen here. And as Karen mentioned, this is part of my larger project on 19th century ideas about perfection and its preservation. This desire to transform the impermanent into the permanent. And I'd be happy to share more, talk more about that in the Q&A or later today. And as a quick side note, I was really thrilled to see this image of this particular Heade painting play such a role in the publicity for the symposium. Especially since in the 1960s, when the web gallery was first opening, it was one of the signal images that was used to publicize the opening of the museum, as you can see in this 1960 news clipping. So I thought it was such a nice parallel in this enthusiasm and excitement for Heade and American art. So it's very much a real privilege to be here today talking about this fantastic painting with all of you as we think about the history and heritage of the Shelburne Museum and the wonderful works in its collection. So here we go with Heade. In the early days of September 1863, Pennsylvania artist Martin Johnson Heade boarded the steamer Golden City in New York, where he had been living and working, befriending other New York artists such as Frederick Church. Now Heade was striking out on a new adventure. After a passage of 18 days on the boat, he arrived in Rio de Janeiro, where, according to a newspaper report, he intended, quote, to paint those winged jewels, the hummingbirds in all their variety of life as found beneath the tropics. It is his intention in Brazil to depict the richest and most brilliant of the hummingbird family, about which he is so great an enthusiast, to prepare in London or Paris a large and elegant album on these wonderful little creatures, got up in the highest style of art. He is only fulfilling the dream of his boyhood in doing this. So before he'd even set foot on that ship, he was doing interviews with newspapers and artistic circles to put out propaganda about how this trip was really a boyhood dream that would give him the chance to not only study hummingbirds in their tropical habitats, but that would also culminate in a publication of something that he optimistically made a title page for called The Gems of Brazil. And he spent several months in Brazil, obsessively painting his prized hummingbirds, attempting to court patrons, the Europeans and Americans primarily, who were then vacationing in Brazil. But he often coyly wrote back to his friends in New York or Boston about the progress and how well loved his paintings were, how popular they were whenever they were exhibited. After several months, in the spring of 1864, he traveled to London, where he then really attempted to work with publishers to publish the gems as chromalithographs, which was then a still relatively new process of color printing on really an industrial scale, collaborating with two different and widely respected printing firms to do so. But at the end of 1865, he returned to the US without a full set of chromalithographs or an elegant album, instead only with 4 chromalithographs, which you see here, or 4 editions rather, a couple of impressions of each one exist. So he only returned with these 4 rather than a full album, but also with sketchbooks filled with images of hummingbirds, studies that would give him source material for decades for paintings to come. And I think you'll soon see that the surviving chromalithographs and the varied paintings that he'd produced indicated dissatisfaction with mechanically produced pictures, a distrust of this new quick process of industrial picture production, and instead a reliance upon the analog process, as it were, of his own painting by hand, even if it meant obsessively working and reworking the same compositions, repeating many of the same motifs throughout his career. There's a tension in this project, I want to say, between man and machine, resonating with so many different narratives of modernity and the temporal jumps and lags of modern life. And I guess we just kind of experienced a little bit of a temporal lag and then acceleration again. But before we address the specifics of these paintings and their translation into chromalithographs or those implications, I'll do a little of my own temporal jump backwards to frame or flesh out some of the context in which these works were created. So actually, we did a little bit of this in the conversation because this was the period, absolutely, of the Civil War. He's leaving the war-torn U.S. In the midst of this uncertain outcome. In this period, as I mentioned, Brazil was a popular destination for many Americans and specifically New Englanders. His letters home are filled with anecdotes about which prominent Americans with whom he's socializing. And in fact, I was excited to see a concrete link between the Webb family and Brazil. Here it's a unfortunately fuzzy image of the official document in which Abraham Lincoln appointed James Watson Webb as a minister to Brazil, a position he fulfilled from approximately 1860 to 1869. The document is now hanging, as you'll discover, on the second floor landing of the Webb Memorial Building. And so here we also see James Watson Webb himself as painted by William Merritt Chase. So it's likely, actually, that James Watson Webb and Heade were moving in many of the same social circles during their time in Rio de Janeiro, although I haven't yet been able to track down any concrete mentions of one another in their correspondence. But as I've said, Heade was traveling to Brazil at a time when it held immense appeal as an exotic New World destination for visitors from the US, and I'd highly recommend Kathy Manthorne's book, Tropical Renaissance, to you. So Heade wasn't alone in his excitement about South American flora and fauna, and in particular, the fascination with the glimmering, fleeting figure of the hummingbird. And Christopher Benfey has recently examined the hummingbird's resonance in the work of Emily Dickinson, Mark Twain, Heade, and others in his book, the cover of which you see here, A Summer of Hummingbirds. So another thing for the reading list. We're really giving you guys quite a stack. Heade was embarking upon this hummingbird project shortly after British artist John Gould had published a massive 5-volume monograph of the Trochilidae to great acclaim. Its first volume was released in London in 1849, the fifth and final in 1861. So still a quite recently completed and massive project that promised to situate Gould as the expert on hummingbirds and their representation for the 1860s and beyond. Yet although Gould was known as one of the leading experts on hummingbirds at the time of his book's publication, He himself had never been to South America. He'd only rarely seen live hummingbirds, studying instead usually the taxidermied skins that were shipped to him by traders from South America, writing and drawing from the comfort of his own home in England. So some of Heade's publicity and all of that hubbub about going on the ship to Brazil was to emphasize his firsthand experience there and potentially his interaction with live hummingbirds in their natural habitats. But Heade's letters and journals, somewhat disappointingly to me, revealed that he himself didn't have much luck at finding hummingbirds. Despite his skill as an avid hunter in Pennsylvania, he really liked shooting ducks and other kind of geese and wildlife in the mid-Atlantic and New England regions. So he was really a skilled hunter, but he wrote in his journal the following, quote, "I've been disappointed in nothing in this country so much as in my shooting experience, or expectations. After the most diligent inquiries, I've come to the conclusion that a sportsman might as well go into the woods with a cane as with a gun. Nearly the whole country is covered with thick undergrowth, which is very difficult to penetrate. Game and birds of almost every kind are so very scarce that even without the undergrowth, it would be unprofitable to look for them," end quote. So Heade was not undertaking expeditions into the Brazilian forests to find these elusive hummingbirds. And in fact, he rarely strayed from paved roads that were within a day's walk of whatever home where he was staying. He proclaimed his distaste for the hardships required for any sort of expedition or further adventure in a letter to a friend, quote, "I've listened with great interest to recitals of rough excursions through the interior, and if it could be traversed in a civilized way, I could hardly imagine that anything could be more attractive. But the traveler must content himself with the inevitable mule and a guide as intelligent and as interesting as the animal, and make his sumptuous repasts from the uninviting bag of carne seca that he carries with him," end quote. So much for fulfilling that dream of his boyhood. The food's too bad, can't be bothered. But Heade's own sketchbooks actually betray his reliance upon Gould. And you also see here an image that indicates some of that popular hummingbird imagery. There's really no reason to have a hummingbird to advertise American breakfast cereals. The grain makes sense, the hummingbird not so much. But you can see that a lot of people were using Gould's representations of hummingbirds as an inspiration or almost a direct model for their own presentations of things. And I think an even more damning example, at least in this one, Heade has flipped the bird. But an even more damning example is this image from his sketchbook of Lodogisia mirabilis, where he has really taken exactly Gould's composition, and I mean, it's almost as if he held the paper over the print and traced it exactly. So much for his firsthand experience of the live ones. But Heade still did innovate in his finished paintings and find a way to distinguish his work markedly from Gould's. While Gould's paintings occasionally hinted at bird surroundings by representing a branch or a cluster of flowers, often with luminous clouds of different colors in the distance, his compositions usually fade away into the white of the paper, transitioning to give the species identification in black type against the white page. And that's probably hard to make out. But here at the bottom, it's as though the scene just completely dissolves into the space of the page. Heade's works, on the other hand, represented hummingbird families in the very front of the picture plane with inconceivable exactitude and three-dimensionality, perched on branches with the landscape radically receding into the background. Heade's compositions are actually much more closely related to period taxidermy cases, which featured the stuffed birds mounted in a lifelike, seemingly conventional or conversational manner, upon branches occasionally stippled with lichens, Spanish moss, or fake foliage, with painted backgrounds lining the back of their boxes. Like Heade's paintings, these compositions go to the very edge of the frame or case. There's almost no middle ground depicted either in Heade's paintings or in these period taxidermy cases to heighten the illusion of the faraway painted landscape in juxtaposition with the bird in the very foreground of the picture plane. The paintings depict the birds at life size with exacting detail. Every barb and vein of a hummingbird's feather is painstakingly depicted in glowing colors, suggesting the jewel-like tones of the hummingbird's evocative names: ruby throats, crimson topazes, amethyst wood stars. Yet the evidence suggests that, as I mentioned, like Gould, Heade was merely studying already dead birds, working from their dried and stuffed skins rather than observing their habits in the wild, and in fact basing some of his compositions on period taxidermy. And to show you another image of these kinds of taxidermy habitat mounts from the mid-19th century. On the left, T.P. Liu's My First Woodcock, again, another avid hunter. And on the right, this whole room of these kind of landscape background boxes at Kelk Abbey in England. So this evocation of death is very present. He even included this somewhat plaintive image of a bird, I hope you can make it out, with a really grotesquely snapped neck. And above this hazy sketch, he just penciled words from an epitaph by Robert Robinson. Quote, "Bold infidelity, turn pale and die. Beneath this stone, 4 infants' ashes lie. Say, are they lost or saved? If death's by sin, they've sinned because they're here. If heaven's by works, in heaven they can't appear. Reason, oh how depraved." So a little overwrought 19th century sentimentality for you. But right, this was usually used as an epitaph for children who had passed away in infancy. So this notion of a creature with so much promise, beauty, innocence, their life ended before they really had potential. So there's some sort of very strange, affective reasoning that Heade is experiencing here. And the sketchbook page, I think, very acutely points to the practice, I think, of working with dead specimens, despite Heade's professed affection for the living creatures. And at this point, I'd like to jump ahead again, a year or two, out of Brazil and into 1866, when Heade painted the work now in the collection of the Shelburne Museum. One of the things that really struck me about this painting is its unusual shape, that arched form, rather than a straightforward rectangle, something that seemed really surprising to me. But actually, the more I looked at it, the more I admired the various curatorial decisions that went into that installation and the way in which the room was hung. On the facing wall, almost opposite of where Heade's 2 sun gems and ruby topaz, hang these 2 paintings by Edward Lamson Henry, Old Clock at the Top of the Stairs, which of course itself has this curved composition that also echoes the face of the clock up at the top of the stairs. And even the eponymous Old Clock, and even his Lover of Old China, in which that prominent figure of the china cupboard almost acts like a triptych, an altar with this arched frame, the windows opened to reveal the treasures within. So then when I was ready to leave the gallery, though, I smiled again upon seeing this painting, and please excuse my kind of inept gallery installation shot, but this James Bard paddle steamboat Metamora. So then I realized maybe this arched form is a little more common than I usually think of, but what was going on in the 1860s that made this such a popular format? When canvases are rectangular, it's a big pain to make them curved, and especially to make frames that way. And I started thinking about not only these deft curatorial choices, but what the composition most reminded me of were the formats of 19th century stereo views, the popular 19th century entertainment in which 2 images are placed side by side, seen through a viewer that then creates an illusion of a 3-dimensional view. So the arch here might suggest the illusion of a window, an arched doorway, a breezeway, as is actually depicted in the top view. But the visual illusion produced by looking through a stereoscope is not actually that dissimilar to that of a habitat diorama or taxidermy case. Oh, excuse me. This is actually itself a stereo view, the cutting department, to show that Even making the stereo view in an arch is a somewhat convoluted decision. This is the cutting department where you see dozens of women cutting out those arch shapes from rectangular paper and tossing the scraps in the waste bin. But as I was saying, that visual illusion produced by looking through the stereoscope is actually not that dissimilar, perhaps, to a taxidermy case or a habitat diorama. The objects in the foreground, if you've ever looked through one of these, are really rendered in crisp detail with the full depth of 3 dimensions. Then, as Jonathan Crary has really persuasively articulated, most stereoscopic looking in subsequent further back planes appear really as flat stage sets, pictures merely set behind the object that's so convincingly rendered in 3 dimensions in the foreground. So this arched format might be a way of engaging with this play of perception, the chasm really between the immediate life-sized, rich and deep foreground and that far distant painted landscape. I also might be crazy, but it's fun to think about. So in addition to the compositional play between the life-size scale of the delicately rendered foreground birds and the flat landscape paintings, Heade's work also suggests another contemporary practice of taxidermy. I've mentioned that hummingbirds were enormously popular in the 1860s, not only as symbols or motifs in literature and the arts, but also in decoration and design. And while Heade suggestively transformed hummingbirds with the jewel-like tones of his palette, often using gold paint to heighten the shimmer, by also using the title, The Gems of Brazil, talking about them in other pages as the jewels of ornithology, referring to the birds as sun gems, ruby topazes, and in the case of the Shelburne painting, or in other cases as ruby throats, amethyst wood stars, and so on, rather than their scientific Latin names, which is how Gould referred to them, hummingbirds more literally metamorphosed into jewels for fashionable ladies of the period, when their taxidermied heads and preserved feathers were mounted in gold settings and worn as brooches, necklaces, tiaras, and earrings. Oh yes, as seen in this fashion plate. And in these photographs of a necklace now at the necklace is now at the British Museum, and the earrings are at the Victoria and Albert Museum. For real. London jeweler Harry Emanuel patented this somewhat bizarre design in which the heads of hummingbirds were mounted on golden shields, almost as miniature hunting trophies, with the head of a beast mounted on a crest. And I've actually identified some of the species that Emanuel used. Here you see the ruby topaz, so you can actually see the anatomy of the hummingbird following that of the design, and also Heade's painting of a ruby topaz. In this instance, he also used, let's see, what was it called? Something like a emerald crusted, sapphire spangled emerald. So you see those in contemporary wildlife contemporary 2000s wildlife photography, and then the period jewelry. And here's actually another even more striking example, I think, from the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which also has an amazing Heade collection. The frilled coquette, Lophornis magnifica. So again, you see Heade's representation of the species. And I think it quite compellingly indicates that they weren't just using random feathers, making them in a bird-like shape. These were actual hummingbirds. Their eyes replaced with rubies, their beaks replaced with gold forms. And yes, like I said, these ones actually, we don't know who the maker is. It doesn't seem to have a mark. But Harry Emanuel wasn't alone in doing this admittedly somewhat crazy fashion choice. But I'll spare you the fashion reports and instead just let you know that there are several examples, some of which have maker's marks, but a lot of which don't, that indicate how really widespread this practice was. So take that in. And then let's take another temporal jump backwards, actually, to that spring of 1864, when Heade left Brazil for London, got the adrenaline going from the slides. He's hoping to create that chromalithographed album he optimistically had titled Gems of Brazil. The historical record is somewhat murky as to what exactly happened with which chromalithography firms. We know that Heade worked with at least two major printing houses, one Day and Son and another Emin Hanhart, both widely respected firms whose chromalithographs had been praised for their accuracy and lifelike tones. In his letters to friends in the Boston area, Heade's own letters vacillate, alternately expressing concerns about the quality of his images, noting a need to retouch them by hand, and then, on the other hand, in the next letter, turning around and praising the chromalithograph's fidelity to his paintings, writing to one friend, quote, "I have got one of the chromalithographs finished, and it is difficult to tell from the original." The existing prints, which we don't definitively know whether they're by the Hanhart Company or Day, betray this evidence actually of extensive retouching. And they do, of course, have significant tonal differences from Heade's original paintings. And I'm showing you here on the top level, we have the original paintings, and the bottom, some of the chromalithographs after them. And so I think you can see there, and it's not just an artifact of a weird film or slide exposure. The paintings do depict this cloudy, hazy sky that evocatively suggests the humidity of the tropics, but they're primarily rendered in cool tones of gray. The skies of the chromalithographs, however, are this really muddy, murky brown. And it's possible that some of these darker tones today could be due to age and the acidity of the paper or the backing upon which they've been printed. And I've been in conversation with conservators about this, and it's difficult to tell. But the background alterations, which I think you'll see in a moment, in oil over the finished chromalithrograph indicate the artist's displeasure with the images even as they were freshly printed. This obsessive remarking and reworking, I'd be tempted to call it a perfectionist remarking of the mechanical reproductions with manual alterations. So here again, you see Heade's oil painting, and then two chromalithographs. And I think you can tell from this image that he's really retouched this Museum of Fine Arts print with a lot of purple paint. So not only do the mountains have a more purple overall tone, there are also these very concrete places of light lilac paint that he's added in. Again, a contrast between the Museum of Fine Arts impressions and one from the Amon Carter Museum, which shows some tonal differences. And I think you can really see it in this impression where there are these strokes in the background of purple and an attempt at shading the mountains more, very much so. There's also, these ones kind of kill me because I imagine that if you're a perfectionist, let's see, that right there, do you see the splotch of pink ink? That must have just killed him. It shows up in all of the impressions of this particular print. And so it wasn't just that the colors weren't necessarily looking correctly, there were just these glaring splotches that don't represent anything other than spilled ink. So I think this must have been really difficult for someone who was so careful in his rendering of the plants and the animals in such infinitesimal detail. So it's kind of painful for me to think about Heade seeing these and just wringing his hands about it. So clearly Heade was dissatisfied with these prints, reworking them over and over. And there's also some archival evidence that his finances didn't allow him to complete the project or bring it to fruition. But instead, Heade chose to continue to paint his own copies and variations in, again, an almost obsessive serial repetition of small variations. And if you know more of Heade's body of work, you can also think about the Saltmarsh series that he paints over and over again with different lighting conditions. The still lifes, magnolia flowers, over and over again with different cloth underneath, different slight tweaks in the composition, but again, this really serial reworking of seeming to either hit on something that's popular and then want to keep being able to sell more of it, or trying to find that kind of perfect composition. So we've seen this hypothesized original set of the paintings. These were found in London. He presumably sold them there. For a long time, they were in the Manoogian collection in Detroit, and now they are at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. But in addition to that core group that Stebbins and others have identified as the originals, there's also this huge profusion of dozens of other compositions, some with more attention to the plants in the foreground, as you can see here, and sometimes exact copies, or almost exact copies. The Spanish moss gets slightly heavier over here. But yeah, this is the painting rather from Bentonville, and on the right, a painting that's in a collection in Arizona. And again, more and more of these keep coming forward. These were sold at Sotheby's in 2007 and 2008. And are you guys ready to be overwhelmed? Okay, this is just, if it'll load, a small sampling of some of these paintings, all between 1863 and 1866. And this was kind of my attempt to figure out if there was some sort of continuity in the backgrounds, if there was some sort of ideal order or even separate series. So you can tell in some of them there are very green and lush mountains in the background. That's this upper row. Whereas in this row, which includes the Shelburne painting, the mountains are purple and rockier. They don't seem to have foliage on them. And these in the bottom row seem to have more emphasis on the foreground foliage and almost an invisible, no landscape behind them, just clouds. And frustratingly enough, I tried to do research hoping that maybe the species that were depicted, that meant that they lived in different habitats or different parts of Brazil, but really frustratingly, and perhaps reflecting Heade's lack of expeditionary knowledge, they totally don't correlate to any sort of biological ornithological order. And in fact, some of the species in the gems of Brazil don't live in Brazil at all. So it's a lovely idea, but it doesn't have that scientific rigor that we might expect of a proper natural history work. And so instead really is this artistic exploration of inventive combination and permutation. And I just want to say quickly that while in 2014, and we talked about this a little bit in the discussion after Carol Troyan's excellent talk, while we in 2014 might kind of look down our noses at the practice of copying or reworking of compositions, prizing this idea of an original or some sort of authenticity, this wasn't something that people were as hung up on in the 19th century. Copying was actually seen as a really important part of artistic training and a kind of reworking out of different compositions and different ideas. So this massive but still just slight sliver of Heade's output really suggests that he was experimenting and implementing new tactics, but also rejecting the new industrial process of chromolithographic reproduction and instead still laboring over individual paintings by hand. And actually, along these lines, I think that the Shelburne Museum painting really has benefited from Heade's earlier experimentations. So here, and this is kind of an obvious point, but the sun gem is almost exactly flipped from this chromolithograph composition, and because of printing, probably the original die was actually flipped, if you can wrap your brain around that part. And he's using those vivid colors. I also love that in these chromolithographs, which I think he thought were kind of unsuccessful, one of the things that's really striking about them is that they have this amazing bright fuchsia and mauve and vibrant reds that really pop against the brown and the green backgrounds. And I think in some respects, Heade has really capitalized or paid that knowledge forward in some ways here. Not only does he have the red back of the ruby topaz, but he's actually made the foliage start to turn colors in a way that it doesn't in Brazil. And a lot of his letters talked about how monotonous it was to be in a warm tropical climate. It never changed. You never had that experience of the changing of the seasons that made you appreciate full vibrancy all the more. So he's actually kind of incorporating a little New England aesthetic in here, and he's really laid on that hot pink paint very thickly in these details. And so I'll just wrap up since I know that we had a little delay there. But I still think that these different experimentations have really paid off for the Shelburne painting. There's not only those colors that really glow, but also this mimosa plant, or I think it's a mimosa, this plant with its very thin leaves that are branched has real aesthetic parallels to feathers. And in fact, even the curves of each delineated feather on the back of this bird really kind of parallel the forms and those green into red gradations there. So I think it's kind of exciting how he maybe learned during the course of his own process. And so for my conclusion, I actually want to gesture to another example of Heade's embrace of new imaging technology in his obsessive pursuit of hummingbirds. On a sunny afternoon in 1893, 30 years after all of this, he'd hired a photographer to come to his house, create a family portrait of sorts. The artist, his wife, and, wait for it, a hummingbird feeding from a bottle that his wife holds. So the photograph captures Heade and his wife sitting on their St. Augustine, Florida porch in ornate wicker and rattan chairs. Heade himself is barely visible here, just that jaunty straw boater. But his wife sits in profile, holding a parasol, in her outstretched right hand, a bottle at which a hummingbird feeds. Heade apparently prized this photograph as proof of his familiar relations with hummingbirds, and he sent a cropped detail of the photograph, which you're seeing there. As proof, he sent that into the publication Forest and Stream, which later became Field and Stream, a journal for which he frequently wrote casual articles recalling his experience as a hunter and lover of nature. He described this photograph as, quote, a photograph of my wife's pet hummingbird, probably the first live one ever captured. Similarly, the photograph was captioned as St. Augustine pet hummingbird photographed from life. So in both instances, the text emphasizes the vitality of the hummingbird, the fact that the hummingbird is alive, photographed from life, its fleetingness and its free will. It's difficult to capture in both image and body nature. And I think actually, since we're probably running a little behind, should I fast forward? Oh, okay, I'll just settle in for the long haul then. But it seems that Heade himself was actually uncertain about the legibility of the photograph. As he explained in a letter to the editor that was published with the photograph, my wife has a very small bottle with a bow fastened to the neck so he can sit and sip his sugar and water comfortably. The photograph shows the bird perched on the bow of the bottle. And indeed, although the bird's profile is visible, its head bent to retrieve sugar water, its beak at the tip of the bottle, its body is still somewhat indecipherable. Does it flap its wings, creating that vague blur? Or are the wings simply tucked at its side? The caning of Mrs. Heade's rocking chair and the stripes of her glossy sleeve reveal much more detail than the bird. Is this because of their relative size and scale, or because the hummingbird was moving, flapping its wings to stay in one place? And is some of this lack of clarity due to the printing abilities of Forest and Stream, the journal, and the rough wood pulp paper on which it is printed? Was the photographer unable to focus on the hummingbird, or did he instead prioritize the human inhabitants of the frame, keeping a wide view of the Heades and their impressive backyard? Although Heade centered the hummingbird in his cropping of the photograph for the magazine, the hummingbird is barely visible at all, as you noticed, in the full view of the image. And even in its cropping, the bird's wings and pattern aren't nearly as clear as Heade's paintings of them, with every feather delineated, and I think we'd all be hard-pressed to identify what species that is. The hummingbird's speed and its resulting invisibility or illegibility have been documented and disseminated by many naturalists and nature lovers. People wrote about how When the wings were in such rapid motion, in 1834, one person said, "It's impossible to discern their colors except by their glittering. They are never still, but continually in motion, visiting flower after flower." Similar author J.G. Wood described hummingbird flight as, quote, inconceivably rapid, so rapid indeed that the eye cannot follow it when the bird puts forth its full speed. And with such wonderful rapidity do the little sharp-cut wings beat the air that their form is quite lost. And while the bird is hovering near a single spot, the wings look like two filmy gray fans attached to the sides. While darting from one flower to another, the bird can hardly be seen at all. So in this passage, Wood highlights the incomprehensibility of hummingbird flight, its rapidity of movement abstracting its usually sharp-cut wings to filmy gray fans, presaging Heade's blurry photograph. And T. Wentworth Higginson described hummingbird's flight as whirring among birds insect-like and among insects bird-like, his path untraceable, his home unseen, an image of airy motion. But most disconcerting of all to period viewers was the hummingbird's simultaneous rapidity and stillness, the strange and contradictory forces at play when it hovered in midair, usually while feeding. As one naturalist observed, quote, "Hummingbirds are perhaps the most remarkable examples in the world of the machinery of flight, the power of poising themselves in the air, remaining absolutely stationary while they search the blossoms for insects, is a power essential to their life. It's a power, accordingly, which is enjoyed by them in the highest perfection. When they intend progressive flight, it is effected with such velocity as to elude the eye. The action of the wing in all these cases is far too rapid to enable the observer to detect the exact difference between that kind of motion which keeps the bird at absolute rest in the air and that which carries it along with such immense velocity." So this juxtaposition of velocity and motionlessness, hummingbird flight, it was seen as the highest attainment, the perfection of flight, exercising control over movement and motion and somehow simultaneously also stillness. So hummingbirds somehow embodied contradictory qualities of both motion and stillness, suspending themselves in midair by moving too quickly to be seen with their mechanisms of flight imperceptible to human eyes. And I think I am going to abandon a section on evolution because that's a whole other kettle of fish, as we all know. But just to think about that long duration, millennia of evolution that we're seen as having really achieved such perfection in the relationship between the hummingbird's beak and proboscis and the retrieval of pollen and sustenance from flowers. So there are these very, I think, compelling juxtapositions of different forms of temporality going on in these images. You have the tension of Heade's time of slow looking and slow manual reproduction, the quick speed of the chromalithographic process, and all of this, I think even though these are seen as landscapes or still lifes of tiny precious birds, I think they actually really get at a lot of the kind of profound questions about 19th century experiences of temporality and modernity. So thank you for your patience.
I wanted to make a comment, not a question, about copying,
Yeah.
quote, which strikes me as rather similar to a process that a writer goes through in editing draft after draft after draft.
Absolutely.
And or a poet revising a poem. It is a search for perfection, and not necessarily something you could put down as, just a copy.
Absolutely. Yeah, something that unfolds and always changes. It's, I think I got afraid that I would be putting too much of myself in there. If I thought, oh, it's like when you're reworking the passage, but thank you for that. Yeah.
I was curious to hear a little bit more about the market for these paintings and chromalithographs and some of the types of collectors who would have had these in their collections.
Absolutely, thank you. So Heade, in a lot of his letters back from Brazil, he'd talked about how people were clamoring to buy them, but he refused to sell them until he could take them to London to have lithographs made. He said something like, "I wouldn't take $10,000 for them." And then, which is a lot in the 1860s. And then later, of course, he ends up selling them for maybe at most, I think $250 was about the going rate. Cyrus Field saw them, of the telegraph fame, saw them and was really excited about them. And in the period, actually, when he was trying to reestablish the transatlantic telegraph cable, which had been established, I think, in 1864, or no, before the Civil War, failed and then had to be delayed until after the Civil War. He was hoping that he could exhibit Heade's paintings at his home, his mansion in New York. And he wrote this to a friend with a lot of pride, but also saying, don't tell anyone, because if the cable business falls through, he won't have any money. And I want to be able to approach another patron and not have them feel like they're the second choice, to that effect. So again, that's another moment at which I think it's really interesting that Field is maybe thinking about these same issues of transmission and temporality and communication. So let's see, a lot of the paintings also that Stebbins catalogs, some of them do have inscriptions on the back to friends, but it was mostly collectors in the Boston area and in New England. I think he had contacts with Vaux galleries, and he also exhibited actually the chromalithographs with Williams and Everett galleries, and I think contracted someone to help retouch some of the chromalithographs. So there must be more of them out there. So if you find them, that's very exciting, and give me a call. But yeah, so these were kind of the typical American collectors, the same people who were looking at Church, Frederick Church, but whereas Church had these, really massive, elaborate, huge things, these were very delicate, life-size pictures. So it's a different kind of market.